It's interesting then that the Burroughs estate would have given light to a spin-off series that's contradictory to the original's message. However, perhaps money talks, and with 24 sequels, movies and TV shows based on Tarzan, I'm sure that Burroughs Inc. are probably down to the last 100 or so million. Hello and welcome to my review of Bunduki, a J.T. Edson 1975 novel that continues the Tarzan legacy begun by Edgar Rice Burroughs so many years ago. And far from any kind of unpleasant cash-in that you might expect, the Burroughs estate actually did approve at least of the first 3 novels of this series, and there are 5 novels in total. And this being number 1, we can all rest assured that it was in fact rubber-stamped by the powers that be. In the tradition of many Tarzan novels, this story pits a modern man into the mysterious and sometimes sinister unknown of a far-off land in order to protect a member of the fairer sex. The plot begins with James Allen Vale Gunn, famous throughout the continents by his nickname Banduki, waking alone in a jungle with no knowledge of how he got there, why he's dressed in nothing more than a loincloth, or how he came to be armed with a modern bow, arrows and knife. His last memories were of him and his sister Dawn plummeting to certain doom after an accident in a game reserve. In truth, Bunduki and Dawn are unrelated. They are, however, both the adopted grandchildren of the legendary Lord Greystoke, aka Tarzan. Bunduki is alone, however, and sets off to find Dawn, driven by a sixth sense that points him in the right direction. He's troubled by the idea that he's observed, but unsure why or by whom. He pays it no more attention than that. His mind is drawn to the variety of animals that he sees, incongruous with the nature of Earth. He's called upon to rescue Jo Fane, a local girl, from a group of aggressive Mangani. He continues his hunt for Dawn, with Jo Fane tagging along and lusting after him to no effect. Dawn, meanwhile, has troubles of her own. Her circumstances are much the same as Bunduki's. She too feels observed, and she too has a sixth sense that leads her in the rough general direction of her brother. However, she's soon met by a patrol of zebra-riding warriors, a contingent from a local tribe riven by internal politics. They wish to capture Dawn, but using her modern weapons, she's able to kill a trained eagle and one of the warriors before she flees. Seeing the effectiveness of the bow, both factions decide that they want it for themselves, and they give chase. In the jungle, Dawn rescues Atvi from a tiger, is attacked by a startled rhino, and in the process of leading the warriors away from the injured Atvi, is recaptured. Jo Fane, meanwhile, tells Bunduki that the warriors are people takers from a neighbouring tribe. She initially believed that they took people from her tribe to live with them as concubines or wives. However, she then chose to escape from them after starting to believe that that was not the case. Instead, it seemed likely that she was intended to be the sacrifice to their zebra god, and Atvi, her fiancé, was looking for her to rescue her from them. And he does, in fact, bump into Bunduki and Jo Fane after a skirmish with some of the other zebra warrior scouts, and then, learning of what's happened, Bunduki sets off alone to rescue Dawn. The two factions of the zebra warriors, they both want to use Dawn's fighting skills to rid themselves of the other faction. However, one side already has custody, forcing the other to head out into the jungle for support from their missing scouts. They instead find Bunduki and return with him to the camp. He tricks them, causes a diversion, and both he and Dawn escape and flee. They are then met by a mysterious supplier, an alien being who is supplying the equipment and other needs of the planet's various peoples. He offers Bunduki and Dawn the chance to return home or to stay and function as the gamekeepers of the planet. With love slowly blossoming between the two of them, they choose the latter, and the being then disappears, while this novel promises that what happens next will be told in the sequel. While Burroughs' Tarzan was heavily focused on genetics and the debate of nature versus nurture, portraying Tarzan as man's fullest potential unrestricted by the comforts of civilization that have weakened and degenerated his cousin, Bunduki is an adopted grandson, no less capable, but thanks to his family's tutoring. This puts Edson and Burroughs, in the first books of their respective series at least, are at odds in that debate. It's interesting then that the Burroughs estate would have given light to a spin-off series that's contradictory to the original's message. However, perhaps money talks, and with 24 sequels, movies and TV shows based on Tarzan, I'm sure that Burroughs Inc. are probably down to the last 100 or so million. However, if Bunduki's genes are perhaps less impressive than Tarzan's, they are passed down from his own ancestry, which includes mark counter from Edson's floating outfit series. In Edson's series, at least, then, both Tarzan and Dusty Fogg and Co.'s adventures are not just canon, but here both are described as a series of biographies. As approved biographies go, it is fairly typical in its portrayal of its subject as not just infallible, but rather closer to perfect. Banduki looked ideally suited to meet the challenge of his surroundings. 6'3" in height, he had blonde hair taken straight back and a tanned, exceptionally handsome face. While his blue eyes could twinkle with merriment, they were at that moment as cold as a June sky just before a storm. He had a tremendous spread to his shoulders with massive biceps and forearms to match. His bronzed torso slimmed down at the waist, then spread to long legs which were so well developed they could carry his 220-pound weight with a light-footed and effortless-seeming agility. But that's not all. For all his great size and enormous strength, Bunduki could have come close to world record class as a sprinter, long-distance runner, swimmer and gymnast. And of course he has the benefits of a classic education and the foresight to turn his back on the enervating civilization to hone his Ubermensch prowess in the wilds of Africa. But our modern Hercules, master of all trades and jack of none, has at least a foil, a dramatic opposite to spice things up, because Dawn is barely capable of anything. She had thrown herself wholeheartedly into every permissible kind of sport and excelled at them all. Oh, she's also world-class as an athlete, gymnast and swimmer. However, there are, as Edson tells us, some limits to her physical prowess. She would, in fact, be in mortal danger if a big black-maned lion should attack, which seems very specific but quite possible in the circumstances. But Dawn's skills also weigh in on the nature and nurture debate that Burroughs began in the first Tarzan novel. They are the product of a rough-and-tumble upbringing because Dawn was always a tomboy, though that is slightly undercut by her later description as always something of a tomboy. But thank heaven for her formative tomboy years, clearing things up narratively and explaining her near perfection. And if there was just one thing that might make you question her boyishness, it was probably her bosom heaving and straining at her dress. Just part of a figure that many a sex symbol movie star needed artificial aids to attain. Bust 38, waist 20, hips 36. But Dawn can only be described as near perfection when she runs afoul of the zebra-riding warriors whose priestesses' full, firm 39 inches of bosom and 37-inch hips and buttocks edge her out by just an inch at a time. Poor little Jorfain is shortchanged on that front, with only an unspecified, exceptionally well-developed contours, as is the priestess's buxom and pretty attendant. There is, of course, barely a stitch of clothing to cover up any of these assorted assets. We seem, or at least we do when Banduki beds the priestess while bound and still outperforms all of her nation's manfolk, to be heading away from Burroughs' jungle and closer to John Norman's counter-Earth. As you both surmised, we transported you to the planet Zilikian. You have never heard of it. It lies exactly opposite the Earth and follows the same orbit around the Sun. The fact that this is a Star Trek-style morality test is obvious as early as page 13, but nothing is made of the difference between the two of them when Bunduki refuses to kill the Mangani tribal leader that he fights to rescue Jorfain, or when Dawn, at least doubting herself initially, kills a zebra rider and the trained eagle and a tiger. But that's because this entire world is based on an extremely dubious morality. The superpowered aliens transported early humans to Zilikian to see how they would develop, and even though their habitat is also home to tigers, lions and other predators, they were sufficiently free of enemies and disease that they multiplied rather rapidly. Rather than introduce more tigers, for example, the aliens instead chose to introduce another race of humans and give them weapons and a zebra-riding based religion that required human sacrifices from the other tribe. Perhaps you could argue that we've moved away from the nature versus nurture debate and into intelligent design territory here, but when presented with the choice of A, staying and basically ruling this hellhole, or B, returning to Earth, they don't take the actual sensible choice, which is C, murdering the aliens responsible for creating this entire appalling situation. But this grisly population check isn't the only problem with morality here. I think Burroughs himself would have had an issue with the way that they've supplied every whim of the people that they've introduced to the world. The way the aliens do this is a way that would then strip them of any need to progress and develop, which is not only the reason for man's existence, but it's also the reason the aliens brought them here in the first place. That is explained away in the finale by the alien supplier proposing that the technical advancement has done mankind no good on Earth. He, of course, makes no suggestion that he will stop using his own advanced technology. Part of what gives the original Tarzan its restless energy is his frantic travelling from one group of imperiled incompetents to another. Tarzan is constantly on the move, rushing from place to place, from danger to danger, and the civilised folk of Jane and her relatives offer somebody to actually be under threat. Here we have Bunduki and Dawn, world-class at everything. Briefly, they are saddled with Jorfain and Atvi. The latter is a warrior himself, and at one point injured, but they're more of an inconvenience than at risk, and once united, their story is no longer required. The energy, the peril, the adventure, all three are rather weaker than their own ancestor, Burroughs' original story, and hold less interest than the intrigue surrounding Bunduki and Dawn's mysterious transportation to this place. But that is rather of the original series of Star Trek standard, and our heroes here are far less interesting together or apart than Kirk and Spock. It's actually possible in places to read the attempts to mimic Burroughs' musings on the world, how it got to be, how it is, and where it's going, as rather formulaic. Though it's difficult to see who the ultra-powerful, infallible and perfectly moral Banduki is not actually a role model for, and the same could certainly be said of Tarzan. Edson's more specific singling out of certain groups as lacking the same fortitude and fibre is less effective for it. Nor had Bunduki ever become embroiled in so-called new morality which had infested the Western world. Even during the short period he had spent in England, he had avoided becoming entangled in its meshes. Having chosen to be self-reliant instead of dependent on the British welfare state, he did not need or use sexual prowess to conceal a lack of other masculine achievements. While Edson's obsession with buxom women and their assets, and the encyclopedic-style description of some of the animals, such as the abbreviated version on your screen, and the rituals around the Mangata tribe, they're more reminiscent of John Norman than Burroughs. But it isn't always clear if you're reading a facsimile or a parody, and part of that down is to the ridiculous excess of exclamation marks. On page 13 there are 6 in total, but throughout the book it isn't uncommon to see them used in 2s and 3s, such as the examples on the screen now. This is from the very first page of the book, so it actually rather sets a tone. Suddenly, a realization of what he was seeing flooded through him. It was followed by amazement and disbelief. His feet were bare. The slight breeze felt as if it were blowing on predominantly naked flesh. Dawn was alive and might be in peril. Bunduki needed to know no more than that. For the time being, nothing else mattered. First, however, Dawn had to find a way to enter the bushes. Having done so, she had to reach it before the first of the riders caught up with her. But if you're using these statements with an exclamation mark for impact, pace and tone, then making them shorter and snappier will certainly help you along with that. But even then, I probably wouldn't recommend it. But it isn't just this that gets repetitive. Phrases are repeated quite regularly, which is perhaps a nod to Burroughs' style, which is similar in that regard, but so is John Norman's. And while this equilibrium issue is fairly minor, this next one is genuinely awful. Bunduki bent his right knee and thrust his left leg backwards in a long stride. Doing so caused him to sink below the arc of the sword's swing. By thrusting his left leg outwards and bending his right knee, he crouched and drew the knife downwards. All of this is just so awkward, and it sucks the life out of these passages, which are both in action scenes. And if you wish to stand up and try bending your right knee and thrusting your left leg backwards in a long stride, when you fall flat on your face, please send me the video. Bunduki and Dawn's adventures on Zilikian were part of an initiative test designed by the aliens as part of their recruitment process prior to offering the job of chief wardens. Yet the meetings with the various tribes were described as by pure chance, and by giving them weapons and hypnotizing them to know how to communicate with others and where to find each other, they've more or less removed all of the initiative from their initiative test. Which might be just as well, because I think that Bunduki, despite what Edson tells us about his great education, he's really quite thick. While considering the alien's job offer, Bunduki muses that everything on Zilikian is completely natural, unspoiled, free from the mental and physical pollution of Earth and its bitter social conflicts. Apparently, for the moment, forgetting that all of the people and everything that they have and use is supplied from off-world by the aliens. All of the people were transported here, again by the aliens, as were most of the animals. Additionally, the Mangata prey on the other tribes for their blood sacrifices, which sounds a little bit like a social conflict to me. Meanwhile, Jorfain and Atvi's tribe have been mentally stunted by having their every whim catered for and spend all of their days satisfying themselves in ways which would make the derided new morality of Earth seem quite tame. Both tribes also fight skirmishes with the Mangani, or hairy people as they're sometimes known. Basically, the interference from the aliens has turned Zilikian into a shithole, and every single one of Bunduki's observations on its unspoiled glory is wrong. Now, I've moaned about the novel for 30 or 40 minutes now, and I have to contradict myself just a little bit. Bunduki is Tarzan's weaker, less interesting relative, but it isn't completely awful. The plot is nothing particularly interesting, and if the characters had more than one dimension, they'd be boringly perfect in that one too. But being 60% of Tarzan is actually fairly reasonable. And if Bunduki the novel is indistinguishable from parody or tribute act, at worst, it's almost bad enough to be good. It's easy to read, and none of its faults present a significant challenge to finishing it. And that's about as close as I can get to a recommendation for this book. If you like this video, then it's very representative of what you'll find mostly on this channel. So if you like and subscribe and ring that bell, you'll be notified when I upload more of this sort of thing.